All right, in section 1, we looked at story in a very broad sense, the very basic key components of story, which was setup, conflict, and resolution. And those are the basic fundamentals of any story, but it's very broad. And so in section 2, we're going to dive in and start looking at a lot of the more detailed information, views of story parts, of structure, some details and titles, things like that. So we're going to dive in there and mess with all that kind of stuff. And before we get going, I just want to remind you, I said it in the syllabus, but also I want to refer to these books again. This is the part where we're going to dive into a lot of things here, and we're going to hit some good detail on it. But if you really want to dive into the nitty-gritty part and get some really good detail, then please check out these books. Again, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, Save the Cat, and of course, the big one, Story by Robert McKee. So if you want more information on things we're going to discuss today, check this out. There's going to be some good stuff in there. Some of it we're already going to talk about, but if you want to look at more in depth, that's the way to go. So let's begin. When we talk about story, we don't just look at the person's life from point A to point B, right? We don't just say, all right, he woke up and then he did this, and we don't live every single minute of that character's life. Because if we did, our life would just be passing by, right? No, when we do a story, we're diving into specific moments of that character's life or characters' lives, right? And so when you do story, we're trying to pinpoint the moments and only the moments that we absolutely need to know to move forward. So to say that again, if this is the story, we don't have this much time to tell the story. We need to focus on this moment, this moment, this moment. Only the actual moments, the events, the things that occur that we really need to know to make the story work. So when we dive forward, the things that we're going to talk about is these titles, these characteristics, these events. They're all to help us in dealing with what moments are the precise moments we want to dial into and focus on. So that's the goal here, is to look at it from that perspective. So to begin, let's just start with the most important and basic thing that we're going to talk about, which we'll start over here. It's the protagonist. Now, the protagonist, another way to look at him, is the hero. He is the hero, the person that we're going to be watching. Now, the protagonist can be a man, it can be a woman, it can be a fish. The protagonist can be a group of people. Protagonist is just the person in the film that we are rooting for, the person that we are going to vicariously live the story through that person's eyes. So in the case of Finding Nemo, we're going to kind of watch it from the perspective of there's multiple protagonists. You've got the father and Dory, but then you've also got Nemo and his buds, and they're all trying to beat the antagonist, which is all the forces that are keeping them apart. And so the protagonist can be a single person, it can be a group of people. It's just whoever it is that we're going to most live the story through. So for instance, in Lord of the Rings, you've got a bunch of different protagonists, but your main one obviously is going to be Frodo as he goes from point A to point B and that whole deal. So you have a wide variety of protagonists that you can do, and a protagonist can pretty much be anything. And at the same time, it has to be the thing that we're focusing in on. We're going to live. We want the protagonist to win. We are going to root for him. When he experiences victory, we want to experience victory. When he experiences loss, we're going to feel that loss. So the protagonist, when we refer to that, that is the person in the story that the story really is all about. And then opposite the protagonist, if we're going to go to the other end of the spectrum, you're going to have the antagonist. Antagonist. There we go. Now, the antagonist sounds exactly like it sounds, is exactly as it sounds. I don't know, whatever. The antagonist is basically the opposite of the protagonist. He would be what we would call the villain. And again, the villain can be a guy, girl, a group. It can be a thing or an event. An antagonist can be anything that's in the way that's going to upset and oppose the protagonist in all the protagonist's activities. So really, the antagonist is just the thing that's in the way, the thing that upsets the balance. So in Finding Nemo, the antagonist is Nemo's scuba diver shows up, takes Nemo away. And then from that point on, how is he going to get back from that awful place? In Star Wars, you've got some epic villains with Darth Vader. In Frodo, you've got, in Lord of the Rings, you've got Sauron and you've got the Mordor. And so there's a lot of antagonism factors there. But usually, in most stories, there's going to be just one primary villain, and that is who the antagonist is. So you've got our hero and you've got our villain. We're going to live vicariously through the hero's eyes, and hopefully you're going to experience victory with them. And at the same time, whenever the antagonist is coming after us, we're going to feel like the antagonist is also coming after us. Although I meant antagonist after protagonist. Sometimes my words get a little messed up. So that's protagonist, antagonist. Now the next thing we want to look at is the setup. Now we talked about this in the basics section here in section 1, but this is section 2. So let's dive into setup a little more information on setup. Now when we talk about setup, it's that part of the story that gets us going, right? Usually it's going to have the protagonist somewhere in the setup. And it's going to start off, once upon a time, there was a prince or a princess or whatever it happens to be, and that's our protagonist. And their life looked a certain way, and it was doing this, and they would do laundry and dishes and whatever it happens to be. And we have the setup time period. But it's really important to note a couple things about the setup that's really important. The setup is only as long as it needs to be. You don't want the setup just going on and on and on. You only want it to be as long as it needs to be for the rest of the story to make sense. So when we look at Humpty Dumpty, the setup is very short. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. That's your setup. It's only a few words. We don't need to know anything else about Humpty Dumpty to get the story, which is he's going to have a great fall and they're not going to be able to fix him, right? So in Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, we have our protagonist mentioned here in the setup, Humpty Dumpty. He sat on a wall, and that is your setup for the story. So sometimes the setup needs to be longer. In order to contain more information, you need to get an idea of all these characters, where they are, what's going on, things like that. But the setup, it needs to be as short as possible. You only want to make the setup as long as it absolutely needs to be for us as the audience to get into it. If you make the setup too long, people are going to get bored, their minds are going to wander, and it's just going to be like, okay, whatever. So when we talk about setup, it's this time period at the beginning. Usually it's going to introduce us to the protagonist. Sometimes the antagonist might also be in there, but it's only as long as it needs to be. So usually in a movie, the setup is usually no more than 10 minutes at max. Usually the setup is not any longer than that. I think the longest setup is maybe the Lord of the Rings series. You have to set up a whole lot of stuff about the ring and all of that, and so it kind of takes a little bit longer. But usually, in most cases or in a novel, the setup is going to be in that first chapter, and the first chapter will end usually by the time the story is going to get to the next part, which is the second part. So we have our setup right here, our setup, and then we are going to reach this. Now, earlier we referred to this as conflict because that's what it is. It is conflict. But here we're going to name a particular moment. We're going to focus in on an event, and this event is called the inciting incident. Now, the inciting incident is the thing that is going to set off the rest of the story. It is going to be the thing that starts the journey, the thing that unbalances the life, the thing that unbalances the setup that we mentioned, the thing that throws the protagonist into a mess where he's going to have to deal with something. It's the unexpected thing, the thing that the protagonist would never have planned to do, but suddenly this thing has happened. And that thing is the inciting incident. So in Lord of the Rings, when they discovered that Bilbo has had the ring all the time and now Frodo's going to have to take it back, well, that's the inciting incident. They've discovered the ring, and so we have to get it back. In Finding Nemo, the inciting incident is that Nemo gets taken, and from that point on, the whole rest of the story is about, well, we got to get poor Nemo back, right? So our inciting incident is going to throw the protagonist in a complete disarray. He's going to completely mess the protagonist up and force him to do something new, something unexpected, something unplanned. Now, the inciting incident has to do 4 major things. I know it's conflict, but it has to have 4 major elements within it to make it a good and proper inciting incident, which the first thing is the inciting incident must force a response from the protagonist. If your hero has some sort of conflict show up, but he can just ignore it, then it's not a real inciting incident. An inciting incident has to be something that comes along and just completely, boom, stops the protagonist in his tracks or her tracks or its tracks, and then it can't go anywhere. It has to deal with the inciting incident. So this could be as simple as the protagonist was at his house in bed and then there's an earthquake. You know, it's going to affect him somehow. It's going to change something, right? The second thing the inciting incident needs to deal with is that it needs to throw everything from the setup off balance. It needs to change the whole story, change the whole game. Everything was going one way, but now the inciting incident has happened and everything is out of whack. Everything is unbalanced. It's not going to just fit back together easily. It has to be something that the protagonist deals with, and it has to throw everything off of balance. If it doesn't do that, then the inciting incident isn't big enough. It needs to be bigger, harder, more scary, whatever you want to call it. The third thing the inciting incident needs to do is start our protagonist or our group or whatever they are on a journey. So they were here, their life going on, but to deal with this, they're going to have to go over and do some hurdles to deal with it, to get to resolution, which we're going to talk about in the end. So it's going to start a journey that they hit this, and now, because of the inciting incident, their life is going to veer, and they're going to have to go on a journey to get from here to resolution and balance at the end. So it has to be big enough where the protagonist has to respond. It has to be big enough that it upsets the balance of everything. And it has to start a journey for our protagonist to go on. If it doesn't do those things, it's not a good enough inciting incident. And the last thing, it kind of goes along with the setup, what we mentioned, is that the inciting incident needs to happen as early as possible. If it can go earlier in the story, the better. And so when we have a setup, it can be as simple as Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, inciting incident, Humpty Dumpty had a fall. It is something that the protagonist, Humpty Dumpty, can't get away from. It is something that's going to veer the whole story, start the journey on his new deal. It's going to unbalance everything, and it happens the second line of the poem. So as we get to that, the inciting incident has to happen as early as possible. Don't spend, if you're writing a book, 10,000 words just getting us to the inciting incident, because as the audience, as the person who's reading it, we're not going to care if you're just taking a ton of time to get there. So we only want to know the bare minimum of the information to get to whatever the inciting incident is. And here's the tricky part that you can actually sneak in there. Sometimes you don't really even need a setup at all. Sometimes some books, some movies, start with the inciting incident, that they don't really need a setup. You can just, boom, launch them right into the middle of the conflict, and right there we're going to figure out who our protagonist is and then go with them from that point on. We just didn't need to know anything. So the setup needs to be as short as possible, and sometimes you can do it without even having a setup at all. So the inciting incident can be a tricky thing. To look at a really great example of an exciting incident kind of in a big scale, we're going to look at a film clip now from the movie The Terminal. So check this out. So we're going to take a second and look at the inciting incident for the movie The Terminal, starring Tom Hanks. Tom Hanks is our main protagonist here. And he is going to have an interesting situation. He doesn't speak any English as this scene starts because he is from a distant land known as Krakosia. And what he's going to find himself here is that he's landed at a New York airport, and he's going to get some disturbing news. So here, let's start the clip.
All right. I'm Frank Dixon. I'm the Director of Customs and Border Protection here at JFK, which means that I help people with their immigration problems. Now, we're looking for an interpreter for you.
So you got to remember that even during this time, Tom Hanks has no idea of what's going on.
I understand that you speak a little English.
Yes.
Oh, you do?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Good. I hope you don't mind if I eat while we talk. I have a bit of bad news. It seems that your country has suspended all traveling privileges on passports that have been issued by your government. And our State Department has revoked the visa that was going to allow you to enter the United States. That's it in a nutshell, basically, right? Anyway, it seems that while you were in the air, there was a military coup in your country. Now,
So basically, what he's finding out here is that his country, the inciting incident is he's landed here, but while he was on the plane, his country has gone under a revolution. And so now he is a man from an unrecognized country, so his visa is worthless.
The Republic of Krakosia is under
Yeah, Krakosia.
Krakosia. Krakosia. Krakosia.
But of course, Tom Hanks has no idea.
I don't think he gets it. Okay. Okay. Look. Imagine that these potato chips are Krakosia, okay?
Krakosia.
Krakosia.
Yes.
Krakosia.
Okay.
Okay. So the potato chips are Krakosia.
Okay.
Okay. And this apple,
Big apple. Big apple.
the big apple, represents the Liberty Rebels. Okay. No more Krakosia.
So that's one way to make an
Okay?
illustration.
New government. Revolution. You understand? So all the flights in and out of your country have been suspended indefinitely. And the new government has sealed all the borders, which means that your passport and visa are no longer
So
valid.
that's it
currently,
right there.
You are a
So
citizen.
suddenly, our great friend Tom Hanks here is a citizen from nowhere, and he doesn't know it. He can't speak the language. He has no idea that everything has gone awry for him. Now, we, the audience, what makes this a great inciting incident is that us, the audience watching it, we recognize, oh my goodness, this is really bad. But our friend Tom here doesn't
You are
know.
at this time simply
He is unacceptable. Unacceptable. Yep.
unacceptable.
Unacceptable.
See.
Unacceptable. Big Apple tour include Brooklyn Bridge, Empire State, Broadway show, Cats.
Well, I got more bad news for you, Mr. Navorsky. Katz has closed.
Okay, okay. Now I go New York City. Thank
No,
you.
Mr. Navorsky, look, I cannot allow you to enter the United States at this time.
Krakosia.
We can't allow you to go home either.
Right.
course.
And the thing
So,
is, you don't really
again,
have a home. You don't.
What's
Technically,
great
it doesn't
at this
exist.
moment
I mean,
is the
it's
audience
like
has
a-
already
it's like a
experienced
Twilight
the
Zone.
inciting
You ever see that
incident.
show?
We already
Yes,
know
right.
what
Did
is
you get
going
that
to
show over
throw
there?
Yes,
him into
Talking
complete
Tina,
unbalance and
Nightmare,
disarray.
30,000 feet,
But we get to
Guaranteed
watch in
Mystery,
suspense now because our own protagonist here has no idea. He can't
Anyway,
understand.
where do I buy
They
the
keep
night
trying to do stuff, throw chips on him, point him different, and they keep talking, even though he can't
Here's my
understand a
dilemma.
lick of English. And
You
so
know
he's
legal
just
right to
kind
enter the United
of
States.
stuck.
I
And
have
we're,
no legal
as the
right to
audience,
detain
we're
you.
now waiting on him
Seems that
to
you have
get
fallen to
to
a
where
small
we are,
crack
which
in
is,
the
oh no, dude, everything is really bad.
Yes.
So
until we get this
how are
sorted
we
out,
going to have
I
Tom
no
find out
choice
here,
but to
Mr.
allow you to enter the
Navorsky?
International Transit Lounge. All right. So I'm going to sign a release form that is going to make you a free man.
Free.
Free. Free.
Free.
Free to go anywhere you like within the confines of the International
Another interesting thing to notice is we're also getting some setup
Okay.
here, because this is kind of how the movie just starts. It starts here. There's not a lot of setup before. So even though we've
I'm sure they don't
experienced the
understand why
inciting
it's all
incident,
sorted
he's
out by
just
tomorrow.
explained that, hey, you're
Welcome
going
to
to be
the United
stuck
States.
in this terminal now for a good deal of time,
you.
which is the setup. And it works because Tom doesn't know that the inciting incident has happened yet. So we've already experienced the inciting incident, and we have the setup, and it all happens before Tom even realizes it's happened.
Mr. Navorsky, this is the International Transit Lounge. You're free to wait here. These are food vouchers. You can use them up in the food court. Your Caucasian money is no good here. This is a 15-minute prepaid calling card. You may call home if you like. This, in case we need to contact you, is a pager. You must keep this with you at all times. Here is an ID badge for you to get into CBP. Beyond those doors, Mr. Navorsky, I'm gonna need you to look at them. Beyond those doors is American soil. Mr. Dixon wants to make it very clear to you that you are not to enter through those doors.
So it's really
You are
interesting
not to
here
leave this
is
building.
the camera is showing us the world now, again, that Mr. Navorsky is now going to be stuck in unwillingly, and how everything is thrown out of balance. He's surrounded by people here and surrounded by stuff, but in a way, he's disconnected from all of it, and he doesn't even know what to do. He just still does not understand. And then right now, he hears something. And this is how he experiences the inciting incident.
Peaceful resolution. Meanwhile, a troubled populace has to wonder if they will ever find political stability or find the leadership that will secure their place on the world stage.
What's also really great about this is you can see conflict is driving the whole thing. He can't even experience the inciting incident without the conflict of now he's chasing these TVs down.
Have been taken hostage. We're also hearing now that the vice president has been killed, along with 4 cabinet members, 13 injured soldiers, and 2 civilians. By dawn, rebel leaders had surrounded the state houses. In a symbolic gesture, the national flag of Krakosia was torn down as the presidential palace and the parliament building.
He can't even, there's no volume control, now the TV's turned, but he sees it upstairs, so more conflict. Now he's gonna have to run, climb stairs, he's having to carry all this junk. My favorite part here is when he throws it over. That's just funny.
Please.
And now we see guns, we see smoke, violence, destroyed buildings, we see he's yelling, he's wanting help. He's wanting to know what's going on, but he's starting to realize something horrible has happened. I like how his luggage just shows up. So even now there's conflict in him just trying to find out what's going on when no one understands him. And then he's going to have even more conflict as he sees it right here.
Overthrew the government of Krakosia. Bombing and gunfire were heard through the night. And although details
And notice he can't even sit in peace here and find out this horrible news.
have been taken hostage. We are hearing now that the vice
Once again, just like he was in the office a minute ago, he is unacceptable even here. And again, he's cut off, and he's literally separated from his country here by the doors. His country's on the TV experiencing awfulness, but he is outside He is cut off. He can't even be close, which is great writing. And we're going to go ahead and go just a little bit longer because now we need to get to the real issue, which is not just the country and not just that he can't speak the language. We need to get to the fact that his problem is that he's in this terminal surrounded by people with language that he doesn't know. But even now, look, he's trying to call home, but he doesn't understand what he's even holding.
Watch it.
Please. Please. Telephone. Telephone. Telephone.
And this is where we see the reality of his situation. He's a man, he's unacceptable, cut off, away from his country. He's surrounded here, and his world has been completely flipped upside down. Balance is lost, and it is going to compel him to deal with it. He's completely alone, yet surrounded by a sea of moving people. So that's what makes this a great clip. It's what makes it a great inciting incident, is that the length of it, while it's 9 minutes long, it's a really interesting look at how an inciting incident can be played out and happen multiple times over the span of a few minutes. But we can also see the reality of the conflict, and we can see the journey that's now set before him. So the inciting incident here accomplishes all 4 things that we talked about just a minute ago. It's something that he's going to have to respond to. He is going to have to deal with it. It is big enough for him to feel it. He can't just ignore it. It's going to force him to go on a journey, and it happens really early in this film. I mean, the film has just started, and we've just landed right upon it. So it's a great example of an inciting incident. Let's take a look at Pride and Prejudice. We'll see how it begins. You've got Keira Knightley here. It's giving us the setting. We kind of get a feeling of our location, of our time period that we're in. We're establishing all this. No words have been said yet, but we can tell from the way the wardrobe is, the way the house is. Even the music is very well, the music is giving us kind of our time period that we're in.
Lydia? Lily?
And so the camera's moving. It's really working hard to establish kind of all that pre-setup information, the setup stuff that we need to know before the incident can occur. And we push back outside. We're going to see Keira Knightley back out here, and there she is. So she's going to come, and then she's going to overhear a conversation here that's going to start the whole thing into motion.
My dear Mr. Bennet, have you heard? Netherfield Park is let at last. Do you not want to know who has taken it?
But as you wish to tell me, my dear, I doubt I have any choice in the matter.
So the inciting incident has just occurred. We've discovered that one of the houses has been filled by clearly somebody important. And the girls are listening because they want to know what is this thing? What has happened? What has changed? You know, could this be something good coming into their life? They're just totally not ready for it. But we just pick up right there. We didn't really need any more setup information other than what we got before it starts. It just kind of dives right in there.
So that is his design in settling here.
You must go and visit him at once.
Good heavens. People.
For we may not visit if you do not, as you well know, Mr. Bennet. Listening, you never listen. You must, Papa.
So they want to go find out who is this special somebody.
There's no need. I already have.
Have? Oh, Mr. Bennet.
I like the cinematography in the shot right here. They're all layered and you can see them well. But we discovered that the inciting incident just kind of boom, it kicks off. We don't have to wait around. There's not a lot of setup information that needs to happen. It just boom, it starts. And the first dialogue really in the movie is the inciting incident. So it can't happen really early. The setup doesn't have to take a very long period of time. Let's now move on to the next thing, okay? We're gonna focus on a thing that we're gonna title an event. An event. Okay, now notice my board writing has no rhyme or reason. I just do it because it makes it easier to keep track of. Now an event is a specific moment in time. So you can have a whole bunch of events that goes out throughout a story. Now, the inciting incident, it's an event usually in the story, but it can also be the inciting incident can be an event, right? But you can have other events that happen in the story that are not as big as the inciting incident, right? And so when we talk about an event, it's just a moment where something is going to happen. And the trick about an event is whenever it happens, the something has to either push our protagonist towards the goal, which is restoring balance, getting whatever it is that he wants, or an event can push him away and make it harder to restore balance and get the things that he or she wants, right? And so when we have an event, you can have a story, and the story is going to be made up of dozens and dozens, hundreds even, of events that are going to happen that the protagonist is going to come to. But as he comes to them, they're either going to push him away, which is, I guess, down, or toward his goal, which is up, you know? So it's either going to help him or hurt him, or her, or it, or fish, or whatever you happen to be dealing with. So an event is just that. It's these little moments, but depending on the scale and size of the event, it can either be an inciting incident, it might be part of the beginning or end of an act, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the thing we need to focus on when we're talking about event, we need to remember it's just a singular moment of something that occurs that is going to either push our protagonist towards or away from his goal, okay? So that's what we mean when we say an act. Now, a scene is a series of what we would call events. A scene is a one moment in time. So let's put scene here. Scene. All right. Now, in a scene is a sequence. You can have a scene that takes place all in one period of time, but it can have a bunch of events that happen within that one scene. So we can land right in the middle of a scene, and it can go for 5 minutes of a scene where the character is living this whole 5 minutes, and we are experiencing that 5 minutes with that person. But that person might experience 1, 2, 3, 4 events that all happens right there, and each of those events is going to either push him away or from his goal. So an event is a singular moment. A scene can be a length of time that's going along the storyline, the length of time we stay in it. And so you can have a scene, and it can have a bunch of events inside of a scene, but a scene itself is an extended period of time, which leads us right into a sequence, which is basically once you have a scene, you might have another scene here, and another scene here, and another scene here, right? But then you can put them all together, and you're going to have what we call as a sequence of scenes. Look how shaky that board is. A sequence of scenes. So you have your events that are these small little moments that we're going to encounter throughout the story. Then you're going to break those up in. They have scenes, and the scenes can have 1, 2, 3, 10 events within the scene, depending on how long that scene is. And then you can have series of scenes that we call sequences of scenes. And so those are going to build up on the acts. But before we get into acts, what are acts and how the acts work, we're going to see an example real quick of a scene from a film, The Terminal again, that we just looked at. We're going to see a scene from The Terminal, and we're going to see how the scene has multiple little events in it, but that the events are there, but it takes place in a scene of time, and each of the events that he encounters is either going to push him towards or from his goal. So let's take a look at The Terminal right now. Go. Okay, so let's take a look real quick at a scene and some events that happen within the scene and the way that it all unfolds with Mr. Navorsky again in The Terminal. So starting from here, we're all in the same period of time. So he's on a bench, he's trying to understand his world. He's got these food vouchers in his hand. And he's going to need those to survive here in the terminal because he can't go anywhere to get food. And so insert first event. He happens to be sitting next to a girl who needs some help. And so he goes to help her, and the wind comes and blows his food vouchers. And he just breaks the poor girl's suitcase. Meanwhile, the food vouchers are being picked up here, and he's getting thrown away. And so he's going to need those to survive, right? And so now he's running. He's just made some enemies, so to speak, and he's running through trying to track down the janitor. And now we have event number 2.
Food document. Food document.
Excuse me. Stop it. Stop it. Do you have an appointment?
The janitor.
I'm sorry, I don't let anyone to look at my trash without an appointment.
So the janitor here
next Tuesday.
will not allow him to look at the stuff. So he knows his food vouchers are in there, but he can't get them. And now the janitor's saying, if you want to come back on Tuesday. So we'll notice that this event here is completely negative for him. It's going to prevent him from doing what he wants to do, which is get out of this airport. But now he's going to be stuck in the airport and he has no way to survive. So that's only going to make it harder. So it's a great event. It keeps him, it moves the story forward, but it actually pushes him further away from his goal, making everything harder. And the whole thing happens through conflict. He accidentally breaks the girl's suitcase, and then his things accidentally get blown down, and the janitor picks it up and provides conflict by not letting him go and get it. So it's a great scene. It's all happening over one time period, but it's got a lot of little events that are all mixed inside of it. All right, so that was The Terminal, and it's a great illustration of an event and scenes put together and how they work together. So you can have several different events happening in a very short amount of time, but it's all just one scene. Okay, so now let's look at the act structure. Now, stories are made up of acts, and what we call an act is a period of time where you can have an act being this long, or you can have it being this long, or you can have it being however long that the act needs itself to be. But an act is basically a period of time. It's a series of sequences of scenes that's going to build up to one major end incident that's going to happen, or a major event that's going to push beyond all the other events. There were a lot of small events, but then we're going to encounter one major issue. And at the end of that issue, we're either going to have more conflict or a new spin to a new way to go, because we reached a point where we thought we were going to get resolution, but there's no resolution. And so now we're going to go into another act. Or we can reach resolution and the act is going to end. As soon as there's resolution, then that's the end of the story. So if the story is short, like Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, and all the king's horses and men couldn't put Humpty together again. That is one act. It all happens in one act. We have our inciting incident, we have an event which ends the incident, we have some other little events which are the king's men and horses can't put Humpty together again, and we have resolution. So sad, Humpty Dumpty, what a bummer, right? But if a story has an act where it were to end with Humpty Dumpty couldn't get back together again, so they took him to the hospital and they put him on life support. And so now, well, then what happens? Well, now let's go into Act 2. And so suddenly we have this whole other story branching out from the first. So when we talk about an act and how an act functions as in these little events are going to build up to these one major events that after this, there's going to be this option to push beyond and go to a whole other level. Maybe it takes the protagonist and he reaches conflict, so he goes this way, but then he hits a wall over here with this big epic battle or something, and so now we can go into Act 2 or Act 3, and now we're going to go off over in this direction. All these things are just to push him toward resolution. If he doesn't get resolution at the end of the act, then we're going to have another act. So in most movies are designed usually in 3-act structures. It takes 3 acts to tell them well. The first act usually is between 0 and 20 or so minutes, because in that act, you've got your setup, you've got your inciting incident, and then you've got a major choice where our hero's going to decide, I'm going to go do the thing that I need to do. You know, I'm going to go be Rocky or whatever they're happening to be. Save the world. And then they launch into Act 2. Act 2 in movies is usually longer. It usually takes up the bulk of the movie. And then they reach this one moment here where they think, oh my goodness, I've lost everything. And then there's that last little third act that takes place over the last 10, 15 minutes of the film. And so when we have acts, usually movies are in 3 acts. Now novels can be anywhere from 3 acts to 5 acts, 6 acts, however. But most of the time they're going to narrow themselves down to 2 to 3, maybe 4 acts. However many acts it takes to create as many reversals and difficult changes in the story until the character reaches resolution. So that's what an act is. And the crazy thing and an interesting thing to note about an act is that as the conflicts goes, the conflicts are going to have rises and falls. They're going to have serious conflict, and then they're going to kind of resolve it. But the next conflict is bigger, and then the next conflict is really big. They're always building. So as we have act structures, the way that the first act ends needs to have a pretty difficult moment, but it can't be as big as the difficult moment they're going to face here, and definitely not at the end of the movie. The acts need to escalate and build upon themselves. You can't have well, they're going to encounter this huge act, but then I'm going to do little bitty acts, because at this point we don't care. We already have seen that our protagonist has defeated a huge thing. Well, obviously he's going to be able to fix the small little things, right? What we need to see from our protagonist as far as act structure goes is that we need to see that, okay, my goodness, he's encountered a big, giant, difficult conflict that, oh my goodness, can he do it? And then yes, he accomplishes it, but he still didn't have resolution yet. And then, oh my goodness, he's now encountered another problem. It's even bigger than the first. Can he do that? And then, oh my goodness, yes, he can. Oh, but it's still not solved yet. And then we come to our giant pinnacle, end of the world. Can he shoot down the Death Star moment? And then as soon as that moment happens, oh my goodness, we have victory, resolution, and the film is now over. So an act is a series of acts is to build upon these key moments, these rising pinnacle moments that are going to throw your protagonist into an unexpected zone, another thing that they weren't planning to do, another part of the journey they didn't think they would have to go on, whatever it is, because the story is not resolved. So at the end of an act, it can either resolve itself, or it's going to throw our character into this new unresolved area that was not expected, that's going to flip things around for him, and just when he thought it was resolved, it's not. So that's what we mean when we talk about acts. So acts are just series of sequences of scenes and events. And so that's what we mean when we talk about acts. So to move forward here, we need to talk about the all is lost moment. Now the all is lost moment usually comes around here in the film. Here we'll put a little sad tombstone looking thing. Now usually in a film or a book, you've got your setup, you have your inciting incident, and you have your series of acts that are going along, but then toward the end of the film, somewhere right around here, you're going to have a moment that we refer to as the all is lost moment, or the loss of hope moment, or everything is now dark night. Blake Snyder refers to it as dark night of the soul. Whatever it happens to be, this is the moment where your hero character has accomplished so much, but they reach this moment where they're going to lose all hope, that they're going to think that they've lost. It's going to look like it's over, game over. You're never going to make it to your goal. You're never going to win. You're never going to, have victory. And so they reach this moment where something horrifyingly awful is going to happen, and they're really going to struggle with, can I even go on? It's the end. And we call this the all is lost moment. It's the pinnacle moment. And all good stories have this pinnacle moment where everything looks lost, everything looks bleak. But if it's a good story, there's going to be a spinoff that even here in the darkest of the dark moments, that there's going to be a glimmer of hope that happens that brings us into usually what would be our Act 3 moment. And that brings us to our story climax. So here we have our all is lost moment, and it's going to propel our protagonist to do one last major unexpected thing to resolve himself, to accomplish defeat. So this is the blowing up of the Death Star. This is them getting to the Mordor, and poor Frodo's got the ring, and the ring ends up falling into it. We need that last little boost of, okay, what are we going to do? All it looks lost, but no, there's this little glimmer of hope, and the story is going to climax from this one giant thing, and then the climax ends with whatever happens. So if it ends with Luke Skywalker shooting and blowing up the Death Star, once the Death Star is blown up and enemy is defeated and off Darth Vader goes, well, at that moment the story has climaxed, and now all that's left is, well, now we're happy, let's just see the end, let's have a trophy ceremony, and boom, there we go, right? So we have resolution. So we have a story climax, which happens here right at the very end. It's going to build and build and build to this one giant pinnacle moment, and then once this movie or climax is over, then we have resolution. Resolution. I can't even write. I don't even know what that is. Let's just leave it up there. You have resolution at the end of the story climax. So those are all the key elements that you're going to find within a story. You have all these moments. You have the setup, which is the building, what you need to know before you get started. Then the inciting incident interrupts everything and starts the whole journey. And then you're going to have a period of events that happen. They're all broken up into scenes and sequences and acts. And as they build up, as they ebb and flow of, okay, we need to do this now. Okay, we did it. And now we need to do this. Okay, we did that, but we barely could do it. And then it's going to build up to the final climax and then resolution. So all stories, whether you're watching them in a movie or if you're reading them in a book, even Little Women, whatever it is, they're going to have this kind of feel, this kind of, there's conflict, there's motion, there's a rising of conflict, and then, okay, and then up and down and up and down and up and down. And remember, each time it goes up and down, the conflict of the thing is going to escalate more and more and more. It never de-escalates. we escalate until we reach resolution. So there's a steady build. A few other things that we want to talk about that are mentioned when we talk about story. We can talk about setting a little bit. Now, stories can have all kinds of different settings. It could be present day, 2000, whatever the year is. And then it could be far future. This could be future science fiction. We're all in space on planet whatever. Over there, it could be something in the 1800s. It could be back 2,000 years ago, whatever it is. The setting is, when does the story happen? Is it way off from now? Is it now? Because we want to know. We need to know, okay, what are the rules? If it's way in the future and they're in space, we're going to assume they have all kinds of spacey stuff that they can stay alive in space. Okay, if it's in the 1800s, we're not going to expect people driving around in Ferraris and things like that. So we need to know, where's the setting and how is the setting going to influence what happens in the story, because depending on the setting, some things can happen and other things really shouldn't happen unless it's just a weird story. We can talk about duration. How long of a time period are we looking at? Are we living is the whole novel or story taking place within a day, taking place within a couple years, a lifetime? I mean, what's the duration of the story we're talking about? And then location, where are we? Are we in a distant land? Are we in the desert? Are we in the mountains? Are we in the Shire? I mean, wherever the location is also going to dictate it. So if we're going to start out finding Nemo in the ocean with fish, we're going to assume the location is going to determine a lot of things that the fish are doing, which are the fish can't, jump out and fly and walk around, unless, of course, they jump into a bird's mouth, and that kind of throws it off. But so when we talk about setting, you have your period, what time period, how long does it happen, where's the location, and then we have genre. And when we talk about genre is basically a way to categorize what kind of story it is. And so while there's dozens and dozens of genres, we're only going to focus on the idea of a genre, which is, like, for instance, Western is a genre. When you have a Western story, the genre dictates some of the things that we would expect to be in it. We would expect there to be pistols and horses, cowboys, maybe Indians, wagons, that kind of thing, high noon, dust everywhere, the sagebush rolling along. And we would expect this just because of a Western. You don't even have to know what the story is, but if I say, hey, do you want to go to a movie, it's a Western, then your mind is going to say, oh, I know what that genre is. It fits that kind of category. If I say, oh, it's a sci-fi genre, then you're going to expect it to have something to do with some sort of crazy new world with new rules and all kinds of weird stuff that can happen because it's science fiction. It doesn't really have a fit. We would not really expect a bunch of wagons rolling around and sage bushes rolling around or tumbleweeds in a science fiction film. Okay, so we just talked about genre, but now we're going to talk about character arc. And it's a very important thing that we need to discuss in this section. I know there's a lot of information, but we really got to hit this before we can finish. So let's talk a little bit about character arc. So when we talk about character arc, what we're usually talking about specifically is going to be our protagonist. And we talked about how the protagonist is usually here at the beginning and he's got his setup, right? And then he's going to encounter conflict, right? And so then he's going to go on this long journey to reach resolution. But there's something that happens that's really important that we need to see from our protagonist and from some of the other characters as well, which is called a character arc, which means as our protagonist or character goes on this journey reaching conflict, and as he goes over this part to reach resolution here at the end, the person who he is at the beginning and the person who he is at the end needs to have changed dramatically. So the person that he starts out as here, as he goes over and deals with the conflict from start to finish, by the time he reaches the end, there's going to be a change in the character. Something has happened in the process of dealing with all the conflict where our character is no longer the same person. And it's really important that as the character changes, by the time we reach the end, the change that occurs here is you can't go back and you can't unchange it. It's irreversible. The character can no longer be the same person as he was before because of what he has gone through throughout the process of the story. So the change is irreversible. If we reach the end where the character has gone through all this, but at the end he can just go back to being the exact same person who he was at the beginning of the story, well then the character really has an arc. He hasn't changed. There's no thing that we can notice, oh wow, yeah, he learned a lesson from this thing. There's nothing there. So it's really important that we see that our character has changed from the beginning to the end, and at the end he cannot go back. He can never be the same person who he was at the beginning. Another interesting thing about character arc is that while we talk about it specifically with our protagonist or our hero character, it usually happens with all the other characters in the story as well. So as our character, our protagonist might reach the end and he has changed, he has learned a lesson, he will never be the same again. Usually that same character arc applies to all the other characters. They're going to reach the end of the story and they've changed as well because they're all dealing within the same conflicts. And sometimes even great stories will have character arc even with your antagonist. Your antagonist might be the bad guy all the way through the story, but at some point even the character, the enemy, the bad guy might have a change of his own that's irreversible, and at the end of the story even he has changed. A great example of that is Darth Vader from Star Wars. He starts out the bad guy, but by the time you reach the third film, there at the end his final character changes as well to an irreversible moment. So when we talk about character arc, it's really important that the story have a strong character arc where the protagonist and the other characters in the story over time have to deal with a bunch of stuff, but they are going to be different people than they were at the beginning. The person at the end, the person at the outcome, the person who goes into the final credits or the end moment of the story needs to be different than the person that they were at the beginning of the story. So it's really important that in a story you have a strong character arc. There is a change that we can observe over time, and then at the end, the most important part, they can't go back. It's irreversible change. They can't just go back to the person that they were. They've gone through too much. So that's a really important thing. So now that we've talked about all this, I know there's a lot of information, but it's okay. Let's talk about your section project. Okay, so what we're going to do right now, we're going to look at Finding Nemo for an example of character arc. It seems appropriate since we've talked so much about Finding Nemo so far. So we're going to go ahead and look at it and just see the giant character arc between the son and the father. So we're going to start right here with this first clip. It happens really early in the film, so let's look at it.
First day of school! Wake up, wake up! Come on, first day of school!
Oh, I don't want to go to school. 5 more minutes.
Not you, Dad, me!
Okay.
Get up,
Huh?
get up!
I'm
Time
up.
for school, time for school, time for school, time for school!
All right, I'm up.
Boy,
It's time
boy,
for school.
Boy. Whoa!
Nemo!
First day of school!
Nemo, don't move! Don't move! You'll never get out of there yourself. I'll do it. All right, where's the brake? You feel a brake?
No.
Sometimes you can't tell because fluid is rushing into the area. Now, any rushing fluids?
No.
Are you woozy?
No.
How many stripes do I have?
I'm fine.
Answer the stripe question.
3.
No! See, something's
All right,
wrong
so
with you. I have
notice
one.
the very first thing,
Three,
you have the
that's all I
father
have.
saying, you'll never be able to do you'll never be able to do this yourself, Nemo, and you're too little, you can't really make anything on your own. And so the father just kind of freaks out because in his mind his son is completely vulnerable and helpless. And Nemo, of course, for that particular thing, kind of got himself in a rough situation. But now we're going to go ahead and look at a scene that happens shortly after this. So right here, if we're looking at it as a balanced worldview here, then what's going on is the father and the son, they both have a balance going on. They haven't really gone through any significant trials in the area. And so from the father's perspective, Nemo is helpless. And from Nemo's perspective, he's kind of, well, let's take a look at this next clip.
My dad says it's not safe.
Nemo! No!
Dad?
Ugh, you're about to swim into open water.
No, I wasn't.
It's just a good thing I was here.
Dad,
If I hadn't shown up, I don't know.
He wasn't gonna go. Yeah, he was too afraid. No, I wasn't.
This does not concern you, kids. And you're lucky I don't tell your parents you were out there. You know you can't swim well.
I can swim fine, Dad, okay?
No, it's not okay. You shouldn't be anywhere near here. Okay, I was right. You know what? We'll start school in a year or 2.
No, Dad, just because you're scared of the ocean.
Clearly you're not ready and you're not coming back until you are. You think you could do these things, but you just can't, Nemo.
I hate you.
So here in this particular clip, what we see is Nemo is trying to at least act older and be a little more independent. He's trying to move up from his childhood role into kind of adulthood, and he is obedient enough to know not to go out there. And at the same time, he's being with his friends. But of course, his father still looks at Nemo like, you know, he's foolish, that he can't really do anything on his own. And so you have this great moment where he says, you just can't, Nemo, there's things you can't do. And Nemo, of course, wants to do dangerous things. He wants to do things. He's wanting to exercise that independence, but the father, of course, doesn't see his son like that. And so we have them both established in this particular arc. So by the end of the film, what we need to see is these elements reversed. So as we look at this next clip, we're going to see that it's a different father and a different son than through the rest of this clip.
Hey, look out!
I'm sorry. Just trying to get home. Nemo? Nemo?
Dad! Nemo for what?
Dory? Nemo!
Dad!
Nemo! I'm coming, Nemo!
Dad!
Nemo!
Dad!
Oh, thank goodness. It's all right, son. It's gonna be okay.
Turn around! You're going the wrong way!
Look out!
Dory!
Come on! Help! Dory! Get us out!
No! Dory!
Dad, I know what to do!
Nemo! No!
We have to tell all the fish to swim down together!
Get out of there now!
I know this will work!
No, I am not gonna lose you again!
Dad, there's no time! It's the only way we can save Dory! I can do this!
You're right. I know you can.
Lucky Finn!
Now go! Hurry!
Tell all the fish to swim down!
Well...
So there it is. You've got the moment, the father-son moment, where this father is going to have to trust that his son, there is things that he can do. And the son is going to, well, we'll see his thing in a minute, but as we look at from the father's perspective, he's having to finally trust his son will do the right thing, and even in a dangerous moment, that he can do it, he's capable of doing it. And so the son here is kind of going through doing the risk, but the father has really come a long way through his journey to realize I need to be able to trust my kids. And even though in my mind, my eye, he still is my child, he's still the little bitty egg that started out at the beginning of the film, here it's going to be a little bit different. He's realized, okay, you know, he's growing up, he's got a little bit of stuff, and I'm going to have to trust. I can't be there all the time. I'm going to have to trust him to make the right decisions. And we're going to see the opposite character arc. We're going to see it from Nemo's perspective here in just a second.
Just keep swimming! Keep swimming!
Come on, Dad!
You're doing great, son!
That's my dad!
Come on, let's get to the bottom! Keep swimming!
Just keep swimming. Just keep swimming.
Almost there! Keep swimming! Where's Nemo?
There!
All right, so now they're looking for Nemo, and there he is,
Nemo!
the small little child. Father rushes to the son.
Nemo?
And
Nemo?
now we're going to have a flash here.
It's okay.
The father is seeing his son. That's the way his father looks at Nemo, like the little baby, but...
Daddy?
Oh, thank goodness.
Dad, I don't hate you.
Oh, no. I'm so sorry.
And so we have the lucky Finn. And so even Nemo here has learned, you know what, I did a thing and I made a mistake. And so this is his way to say, no, I was wrong, and fix it. So you see how both characters here have an arc, that they both learned a lesson, that through going through all the conflict of the story, they've both learned lessons, and who they are now is drastically different than who they start out the film as being, even though they're little bitty fish. So that's a great example of character arc, and my goodness, it seems like we have talked about so much stuff in this section, so hopefully you're not super overloaded. But if you are, go back, watch it again, make some notes, do whatever you got to do. And then when you're ready, let's go on to our next thing, which is the Section 2 projects. So when you're ready, get to it.